as to how we've got here to date as well, and look at all of the different various events that have happened along the way. And the best way to look at those is to split them into two categories: technological changes and social, political, and legal changes. Often what we find is that a social, political, and legal change happens, which then enacts or creates the need for a technological change. So starting back in 2018, we've had multiple social, political implications with data leakage. Then most importantly, GDPR goes into effect, California CCPA as well. Around a similar time, we're starting to see the browsers make changes. So Safari's ITP 2.0 protocols come out, which start the journey of the third-party cookie being removed from Safari, and also a reduction in the window that a first-party cookie remains on a user's browser, down to 1 day or 24 hours now as well. But if we fast forward, we see as well a lot of changes for Facebook and Google along the way, but most notably, and the ones I'm going to touch on in a little bit more detail recently, is where we move into Apple's ATT, Apple App Tracking Transparency, and also Google Chrome's changes around flock to topics with the origin trials happening right now. It's also important that we remember the social and political implications as well. Obviously, there's widely publicized Belgian DPA ruling, which IB Europe is challenging around the TCF and is ongoing, with the steps plan being laid out as well, but also always good to be mindful of that. So if we start looking at Google specifically, so Google Origin trials of Privacy Sandbox have begun and started this year using the Canary version of Chrome. The topics testing specifically, as many of you will have heard, we switched, or Google changed, from flock to topics, and topics is, best way to understand it, is a lower number of different categories or user groups being used, and a user will be allocated into 5 different topics when they reach a domain, with a 5% randomization to make sure that it's more difficult to reverse engineer and map back user identity. But this has gone public as of the 1st of July, with a rollout ambition for Q4, which means that there is a short time frame to test. And obviously with Google's aim and goal of having the third-party cookie removed by Q3 2023. That depends on if any changes happen to that timeline, of course. Also, that's what's happening behind the scenes, or in a very public manner as well, is we now in the UK specifically have the CMA, Competition Market Authority, overseeing and looking into the deployment of Privacy Sandbox, with ING being announced as the trustee. From my perspective, this has seen a marked step change with a bit more communications, comms from Google to the market as to what they're doing, but obviously still very short testing windows and timeframes. At this point, I think it's always important that we shouldn't forget about Apple. We're obviously very focused on Google Chrome and its deprecation of the third-party cookie, with good reason, where Chrome represents about 80% of browser market share. So the change to the status quo there is much more impactful. But we need to remember that as the world and user consumption shifts more and more to mobile devices, that iOS market share is around 18% globally. Now, if we dissect this a little bit further, actually, Europe is 32.35% iOS based. And if we go one step further, we have the UK at 46.8% and the US at over 51% of iOS users as an operating system. Now, the importance of this is obviously in the rollouts and change, we have the ATT protocol that I mentioned, which was released about 12 months ago, which ultimately limits the sharing of data between third parties in an app environment, mobile environment, but it doesn't limit Apple's first-party data. Now, Apple doesn't release or dissect out their ad spend numbers, but their total ad spend is reported at about 68 billion, which is a growth of 27%. Now, there's questions around the these changes and the use of the SCAD network in terms of attribution and how that is impacting the lay of the land. So I do think it's important for us to always remember that there is another rather large player out there with a large market share in terms of operating systems that has an impact. Now, the good thing or good news is obviously this has been giving us an opportunity to do a lot of testing with ID solutions within the Safari browser environment. And there's a Adform information release that they've seen up to 2x performance when the IDs are in the Safari environment. So from an ID solution, we have a testing bed in Safari that we can kind of look to apply within the Chrome environment as well. So that moves on to the ID landscape. And I'm sure many of you have heard of these terms, but just a bit of a refresher, hopefully feeds nicely into the panel. But we have obviously deterministic identifiers, which is based on a specific piece of data from a user, so an email address or a phone number. And probabilistic is a use of machine learning and various data signals to understand what the likelihood of a user is in terms of their identity. We also have first-party data management tools, so your DMPs, your CDPs, data clean room enabling advertisers and buyers to match their first-party data without mixing it or exposing it. And then a rise of several new technologies like identity solutions, identity management solutions, which are helping publishers and advertisers manage the ever-growing number of IDs that are coming to market. And we've got a little snapshot of some of the probably more widely known identities, but there are now over 80 ID solutions in circulation in the market. I just wanted to touch on the Unified ID 2.0, which I think is one of the more commonly known and talked about ones, but it is open source. However, they are still looking for an independent technical administrator. There's obviously conversations about the application within Europe through EUID and how we take a Europe-centric approach with GDPR. And they've recently onboarded AWS as well as an infrastructure play, which ultimately will help with the deployment of the ID for publishers or advertisers. The good news is, from an ID point of view, there is strong adoption across publisher side with the top 1,000. This is from Adform report, top 1,000 domains being audited. There is a lot of presence of identity solutions being at the ready. What we do need to consider, though, as these ID solutions come out and we're looking at other channels as well, is there is a risk of fragmentation. Previously, we had fragmentation or siloing of inventory. Now we have potentially a siloing or fragmentation of identity, whereby when applied in using multiple ID solutions, marketeers now have to look across those sets and try and normalize and bring them together in a centralized media strategy. So just one to be mindful of as we go down this path of using identity as an alternative solution to the third-party cookie. Lastly, we also have obviously contextual, a really interesting Nielsen study, which talks about the concept of episodic memory being improved through the use of contextually relevant advertising. So that combined with what we're seeing in the attention economy, with Lumen talking about it, can drive up to a 3.3 times more attention and performance as well. And there's a couple of examples of our contextual partners in market on screen now. And before I kind of hand over to Nick and the panel, I just wanted to leave you with one thought. This marketplace is obviously constantly evolving. And there, as I started off this presentation, there is not only technological impacts, but there is social and political impacts. And one of the growing conversations and trends is happening at a political level and at Brussels and at different governments is the next wave of legislation. So we need to be mindful that this is on the horizon. And a lot of it relates potentially around the concept of machine learning and artificial intelligence and its growing use within ID and audience targeting and identity. And it is this notion to the right to reasonable inferences. So as we're inferring and predicting and creating profiles for users, we're allowing machines to make decisions based on that person. So a good example of this is, if you think about smart mirrors, right? You walk up to a smart mirror and it might overlay clothes onto you. However, it doesn't actually know your sexual orientation and may make an assumption or an inference that is incorrect. So we're seeing these kind of thoughts and concepts coming out amongst legislation. And it's just one that I wanted to leave with everyone to be mindful of, that this is an evolving landscape and there are going to be new concepts coming in the not so distant future. So with that, thank you again for having me. Hopefully that was a good overview. As always, if there are any questions outside of the Q&A, please feel free to drop me an email and I'll happily answer. With that, I'll hand over to Nick and the panel.
Awesome, Drew. Thank you so much for sharing that presentation with us. Really, really good insights. And yeah, I'm excited to be moderating this panel with my fellow Programmatic Trading Committee members and esteemed guests. So just a quick introduction from me. As Lauren indicated, but my name's Nick. I'm head of Programmatic at IAS, but I also have the privilege of being the chair of the Programmatic Trading Committee. And as a consequence, I get to work with some really interesting folk, and we have 5 of those interesting folk and fellow committee members on the panel today. So what I'd like to do is jump straight in and ask everyone to introduce themselves and then answer a quick question. So and we'll go straight into the panel. So since Google announced a 2-year delay on the phasing out of cookies this time last year, it's quite clear that there's a lot going on. And the question is each side of the ecosystem any further in their testing strategies, or has the delay created inertia and maybe a false sense of confidence and less urgency? And if I may, I'd like to kind of start with you, Claire. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and then asking that question, that'd be fantastic.
No, absolutely. Hi everyone, I'm Claire Ritchie, Global Head of Programmatic for MediaCom. All things planning, activation, focused on responsibility and how we can really grow a positive future for programmatic. Last 12 months, wow, I think we've seen with some people in divergent directions, both in terms of the urgency and the need to plan for the future. I think the line in the sand that Google has drawn is, as Andrew pointed out, a continuation of the evolution that we've been on for quite some time now. On the whole, I think we're advancing positively, but cookies will continue to be used while they're around. We see some really good pockets of exciting kind of game-changing work, challenging the norm, but around this, I'd say that the majority are acting with caution, and I feel that we are still waiting for the answer on the whole.
Thank you, Claire. And obviously, Claire, you represent our advertisers and agencies, and we're very fortunate to have Michelle from Bloomberg working on the sell side. So if I pose the same question to you, Michelle, do you echo the same sentiments as Claire?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Hi, I'm Michelle Lynn. I head up the data science and insight team for the Bloomberg Media commercial organization. Very nice to be here. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I agree with Claire. I think it's always a balance that we see of business as usual with then a lot of scramble depending on what announcements are made in the market. So I think if we look back to a couple of years ago, I think we were all really, really concerned that something was going to end or stop or profoundly change. And then there was just a lot of business as usual. I think what we're seeing also is, and I think this is a good thing, but a lot of reflection and a lot of work on understanding that tension between the right thing to do for our users with privacy and understanding that and having a deeper understanding that with the right thing or what our clients need to do to meet their KPIs. So I think that's sort of the tension that we're seeing a lot of on the publishing side.
Thank you, Michelle. So both Claire and Michelle, very, very, very clear that while cookies are still here, there's a temptation to continue to use those cookies, right? You know, on the call, on the panel as well, I have Raman and Tanya both representing businesses that are trying to provide innovative solutions that would replace the cookie. So Tanya, if I could ask you to introduce yourself first and answer the same question, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Tanya Field, and I'm one of the co-founders and the chief product officer for a company called Novatique. We are one of the 80 prescribed ID providers available in the marketplace. And I guess, therefore, we have a slightly different perspective. So yes, I think people are trying. We see much more activity on the sell side with the trying and the testing than we do on the buy side. And so for us as an ID provider, the issue is that we're not actually bringing the end-to-end ecosystem together quick enough to test through the system the alternatives. So we find the sell side are really engaging. Again, it's pockets, so some more than others, but the difficulty is in getting the end-to-end ecosystem to basically test and learn. And I think for us, the best situation we have is in Japan, where it's a somewhat closed environment, but where we're actually working end to end and able to demonstrate, as Andrew mentioned earlier, significant results already with the targeting of Safari users, which otherwise can't be achieved, right? But other than that, I would just urge everyone to come together to make sure that we can all work end to end rather than limiting it into subdivided areas.
Thank you, Tanya. And Raman?
Hi there, my name is Raman Sidhu from Verve Group. I joined Verve Group last year by way of acquisition and coming from one of the companies towards the end of Drew's slides on the contextual front, Beamray. And we've been focused as a real-time data platform on the cookieless front, focusing on context cohorts and metadata for, well, I guess since about 2017, since we started moving the ship in that direction. It took quite some time for people to start testing, and what we saw in 2020 and the second half of 2020 was a lot of clients jump on board. And those have moved forward in a big way, and there has been some inertia in between due to the delay. And what we see is there's a big difference between those who are kind of coming in now, just trying to understand things and learning, to those who kind of set sail earlier on and are moving towards a space where they are looking to solve for both planning and buying, and of course addressability without cookies, IDs, and personally identifiable information. We see, depending on the clients and their initial interest and the way they've pushed it forward with their partner agencies, there being a certain information gap in the market. So we're interested to see how that moves forward and how people would catch up just as well, because realistically, for every brand, there is a different set of solutions and there is a different way to deliver performance and measurability.
Thanks, Raman, and thank you, for a great intro. So I'm going to take a summary from that, and it feels to me like there's urgency being put to identify a solution on the sales side, and the sales side are embracing everything, I guess, because you're wanting to kind of, you've got to spread your bets over what it is that the demands are going to settle on. But then to the point that Claire was trying to make, like there's advertisers are still probably pushing the same benchmarks. Cookies are still here. Agencies are duty bound to kind of deliver against those KPIs, which makes it hard for agencies to kind of push new testing strategies. So I want to come back to you, Claire. On a point that Tanya made, that that we're not bringing together any kind of an end-to-end ecosystem. Do you think advertisers, agencies are kind of partly responsible for that? You know, how far have we really come in the last 12 months since the announcement?
I think it's a fair point. And I could quite happily sit here and say, look, everything takes time, we're moving in the right direction, etc., etc., etc. I think we are trying to change the world from whilst using tools or being kind of hamstrung, I suppose, the kind of conversation that we had the other day, hamstrung by the setup of the platforms that we work within. So we are enabling people in our industry to buy using the methods that we have gone from previously. So we are teaching them in a cookie-based environment. We are growing from that sense. That is where our knowledge base and our comfort zone sits. So not only do we need solutions and clients and brands who are willing to spend time, money, and effort testing new solutions alongside us, we need a change of pace, and we need to be able to educate and explain the kind of the real opportunity that comes alongside it. And I do think that we are seeing that. Agencies and platforms are, you know, they're huge businesses, and we move fast with the industry, but there's a lot of working parts with that as well. And I can see some of the brilliant work that we do as Mediacom and Group M, but there's so many moving parts to that it then takes a long time for those cogs to turn in the right direction that clicks in with our clients, the industry at the same time. So we're in this kind of constantly evolving machine. And I think the one place that we need a real pace of change, which obviously Google's line in the sand will do, is those baseline platforms. It's where we're actually buying and accessing that kind of brilliant publisher content and media, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, I absolutely agree. We're not there. We haven't tied up the end to end. There's a want to. We can, absolutely. But yes, we're not there today.
Michelle, I wonder if you can kind of pick up on that point on how you're supporting agencies to kind of move in that direction.
I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity for deeper partnership with agencies. You know, we definitely need to have a good understanding of their point of view. You know, from a publisher perspective, you know, where it's really a client services business. So we need to be open to a lot of solutions, you know, looking to agencies for a strong point of view. But at the same time, I think we're forced to, and in a very, very good way, to create stronger data assets in this moment. And also be creative and be judicious in assessing the market to identify the right partners to integrate with. Because, you know, just because like certain clients or certain agencies, their solutions that are acceptable for one doesn't mean that that's the right thing for us as a publisher or the right thing across the board for all the clients. So I think it's sort of a tricky space right now because, you know, especially that slide that showed that there's 80 different, you know, there's so many different opportunities. And on the one hand, when you're considering things like revenue, and that's the point I was trying to make before with this tension of the right thing to do and the right thing to do for your business, you're sort of in a tricky spot of decisions that you make could be a real barrier to growing your business, but at the same time, you don't want to impact or hurt your users, your visitors that are coming. So I think it's an interesting time where we're understanding privacy more and the bigger impacts of that.
So Ram and Tanya, how do you help Michelle make the business case so that she can then support Claire to kind of create those kind of test and learn frameworks, or even kind of lean on the platforms? You know, how are you going about driving that conversation?
I mean, I'll happily go first. So actually, interestingly, from a Novatique viewpoint, we're going with the agencies. So we're going through the agencies because that's where the money sits, because they work with the advertisers and money tends to drive most things. So we partner with the agencies. The agencies then take us through the structure of, the preference within each market, and it's different within each market of which publishers they buy through. We then partner with those publishers, and the strength of the partnership with the publishers helps drive the demand side, i.e. the platforms that need to be able to adopt the use of the ID. So we actually take it from the agencies and go through that cycle. And that's absolutely key for us because we're an ID player. And I absolutely agree. I think 80 ID solutions is a crazy environment, right? I don't ever believe that trying to navigate through 80, any of the platforms will be able to embrace all of those and work with them. It's an impossible situation. So there needs to be some level of consolidation. And there needs to be an understanding of how those that remain can work interoperably. Because at the end of the day, if they remain isolated and they are just other versions of walled gardens, then it's not going to work full stop, right? You'll end up with a massively fragmented environment that actually won't drive the required uptake to sustain the open web. And I think that's where everyone's driving to. We're all looking to say, okay, how do we keep this a buoyant open web environment? And we have something that plays alongside the walled gardens. And to do that, we need to be sensible about it.
We're not actually an ID provider, but we do cooperate with ID providers as part of Verve Group. We have an owned and operated gaming portfolio, which have logged in users, of course. But when it comes to cookieless and our stance towards programmatic, we see the problem as there's a group of solutions and services which our partners, the agencies, offer to their clients, which include audiences, media buying optimization, analytics measurement, creative personalization. And when we lose the cookie, all of those solutions fall down. Our focus has been to enable all of those solutions without cookies, IDs, and personally identifiable information. And the reason for that is about 85% or so on average, it currently stands, of the open internet bid requests won't have any form of identifier. So using other forms of signals that are there, such as context, for example, and being able to define more precision towards that and being able to optimize towards outcomes is where we stand. And we're able to deliver that programmatically via managed services in any way across all channels. So our focus is very much so in how do we enable and rebuild the solutions which are the business as usual for our partner agencies.
Got it. And like to the point that was being made earlier, 80%, 80 prescribed ID providers, I think you mentioned, Tanya, and kind of Drew back that up as well. The fact that not all of those solutions are available in all platforms, therefore there's kind of walled gardens, makes it very hard for agencies to kind of have an open view of their customers or their advertisers' customers and how they're performing. So clearly an awful lot of solutions and lots of different solutions. Context arguably is available everywhere, whereas unique IDs less so. And then we have the data clean rooms, and again, very difficult to kind of activate within the platform. So on that point, do we actually think there is going to be one solution that replaces the cookie, or are we looking at and if there isn't going to be one solution, then how should marketeers approach the funnel in this new era? I'm going to come back to you, Claire, on that one.
No, I don't personally think right now there is one scalable solution that lines up to replace the cookie as it stands, and as it has, to be really clear, done the job that it has done for such a long time. But then the cookie hasn't actually been a single solution for a long time. And I think this is where we forget that we are on an evolution. We do have change here. We have different things going on in the industry. This is, again, not one size fits all. People have already made decisions to move away from a cookie-based landscape. I think the best solutions will be those that are built on a persistent ID, work across all platforms. To Tanya's point, are interoperable with other IDs, all platforms, and of course, and most importantly, privacy compliant, because I think actually we've moved past cookieless being a nice buzzword that we all talk about. We're talking less and less really about cookieless, more about privacy and responsible and inclusive kind of identifiers. And I think that this opportunity is also all about creating an internet for everyone, where consumers have more privacy, advertisers have the opportunity to learn and engage properly with the people that are relevant to their brand, and therefore relationships should be stronger and more trusted. And if we then tie that back to what you were saying about the funnel, I think we know the linear funnel is not a thing, or certainly not a representation, not an accurate one of the true customer journey. And we see customers dip in and out at all stages throughout that, prompted or not by media. So for us, I think really reducing our reliance on third-party data, really knowing our audiences and their nuances, giving them this kind of open internet and a trusted environment is going to get us to the best point where we can create a solution for the future and a proper conversation with real value for everybody.
If I can jump in just for a second,
Yeah, cool.
Again, like I would agree. And I think as a publisher, we have a real opportunity right now. And I think we've had over the past, couple of years to really redefine the value of premium at this moment. And I saw somebody in the chat was saying, it's going to be a bigger problem for the long tail, the smaller publishers out there. But I think that Bloomberg specifically, have really been doubling down on first-party data assets that allows us to really prepare for multiple scenarios going forward, because I don't know, I agree, I don't think that there's going to be one. And I think that as a publisher, we need to be prepared across the board for many different options that will play a role. When I think about the funnel, like something interesting, Tanya, that I think you said before was, you've seen significant results. But when we talk about testing, like it's always a little confusing to me, because I don't know that we're always on board or aligned, especially client by client, or even maybe like Claire in agencies. And I'm like curious if you're all aligned on what the right measurement is. Because I think we're all talking about testing, but I don't know that there's like a real standardized way of proving what we're trying to do.
Rowan, Tanya, who wants to take that?
It's challenging. Like I could answer this by giving you an example of a solution which incorporates both identity and the context, which provides the scale towards consumers. So if the identity is my customers, we could argue that's a seed audience for me to better understand the types of people that are going to be my new customers, so to speak. How we're looking at addressability without identifiers is saying, okay, these are the people and content types or the content categories that I know my customers to engage with. And in turn, what we could do is prove that advertising was delivered against those content types and also delivered performance just as well. So there's also a challenge when it comes to measurability, and how does that alternate ID funnel through into the measurable side, which is not possible right now in many cases. It's okay to use it for targeting in certain cases, but to be able to measure against it or use it for addressability, that's more challenging. However, we are able to look at end-to-end content types or content categories based upon having a seed audience based on the first-party data, and thereafterwards following that through into who did I deliver my ads to.
So I just want to pick up on that point, because I think in some respects, cookies kind of dumbed down measurement and attribution in that it was fairly possible to game attribution, which wasn't necessarily favorable to the publisher, but favorable to those providers that were able to kind of track the conversions or were doing the retargeting, which, let's not forget, was what's caused a lot of the consumer concerns that drove this kind of privacy agenda in the first place, of poorly targeted, seeing the same ads over and over and over again. But I want to come back to Michelle's point here about how are we, how do we know that we're delivering good results? Are we looking at the right KPIs? Are we aligned on what those KPIs are in the first place? And actually, is measurement about different outcomes? Like, is this an opportunity for us to kind of think at the way we've been calculating and attributing performance is broken? Cookies going away gives us a chance to reassess. So should we be looking at different outcomes and the role that the publisher plays in delivering those outcomes for agencies?
So I think it's interesting because I think obviously we're all used to the same performance indicators, right? So we're looking to measure against similar performance indicators as we've had before, and yet the tools, whether they were good or bad, and I have a view on the fact that cookies weren't great in the first place anyway, but at the end of the day, the tools of the trade and the way things are measured and attributed, or were measured and attributed, are what people are looking for moving forward. I don't think that's necessarily going to work. Where we've done, and I'm going to say limited trials because we've done them in Japan, we're about to move into doing them in UAE, and it's an end-to-end ecosystem, and we're looking at the end-to-end in both of those environments. We're looking at innovative ways of being able to deliver new measurement criteria. We're not all the way through that process yet. But one of the first steps is when we talk about limiting the exposure to campaigns, we want to make sure that that goes across the board and isn't, you see it 5 times the same campaign in this environment and 10 times in another environment, and ultimately nobody's got the joined up view of actually that person's been exposed to that same campaign 15 times, right? So what we're trying to do is, first step, bring it all together so that when you actually limit the exposure of the individual, you're limiting it across the board as opposed to within isolated walled gardens, if that makes sense. And we can only do that within our own end-to-end environment, so we can't do that within Google and Facebook.
Arguably, cookies were effectively, the main use case for cookies, of course, was retargeting, quite often something which we also frown upon in the industry as well. But of course, it had a lot of value. Now, when we look at what was being retargeted, was effectively the behaviors of people against content. And that was what was effectively forming the cookie pools. When we look at a world without cookies, it's more around being relevant in moments. So being relevant, again, the content types, and in the relevant moments, the consumption moments or demand moments, when someone is most likely to consume a product or service. So there's a lot of work being done by brands, large portfolio brands, as to what are those moments and how can we measure against those. On another note, we've actually been working with Claire's colleagues on, for example, one of your major auto clients, in how can we prove that we could deliver test drives. So that's quite complicated because effectively involves last click attribution, and therefore the website of that client following through with their first party cookie and providing back reporting. And in that case, we actually proved that we could deliver better, more test drives than the business as usual setup based on cookies. So the type of measurement that it is, in many cases, people want to stick to what they know. It's about how can we replicate that in a world without cookies, effectively. I don't necessarily yet conform to the idea of new media metrics to necessarily replace the metrics that we currently have. But there is a case for attention being one of those for brand advertising. However, the inputs for attention are vastly different depending on who you speak to. And as a result, I guess, again, what matters is what drives attention for your brand. Is it relevance or is it ad placement?
There's so many different areas that you just touched on there. I mean, attention, how we define attention, I don't think there is an industry standard yet.
No.
For attention. Everyone will have a slightly different view on it. Is it based on heat maps? Is it based on dwell times?
Exactly.
So many different signals. But a point that I do want to pick up on, which I think I'd love to hear kind of Michelle and Claire's point of view here, is this idea that of outcomes, and to your point, Raman, about looking at groups or relevancy, and is there an opportunity to look at other outcomes, signals which aren't threatened by the deprecation of third-party cookie, and whilst we've still got third-party cookies, look at the correlation between those outcomes and performance. I hope that question makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know. And I'd like to kind of come to you first, Michelle, and then to Claire.
Yes, I think it makes sense. I think it's a very tricky space. First is, again, one thing I just want to go back to, sorry, to Raman's point about the definition of attention. And I guess I've just been in the industry long enough that it's interesting, like if I go back 10 years ago, is engagement. We couldn't all agree on the definition of engagement, and even going back further, like these are the same problems that this industry has struggled with. And it would be really nice, I know we'll talk about collaboration at one point in this panel, but it would be really nice to see like agencies and tech partners and publishers come together to try to drive some of these decisions before they're sort of decided for us. Because even if I look at other media, non-digital media, I think we still haven't solved any of those problems and still are operating under false constructs, which probably aren't the best thing to do for clients. And as that applies to outcomes, I think it's tricky because it really varies so much depending on where you are in the funnel, the type of client you are. Are you really leveraging digital for image or thought leadership, or is it all the way down to like a lower funnel conversion metric? So I think it's tricky depending on the type of client and how they're choosing to use their investment in media to drive a specific outcome, if that makes sense. Like, I think it's hard because it varies so much depending on what a specific client would want to do. And it's hard to, I think, standardize any of this given the different objectives that clients have.
Yeah, standardization is definitely not our strong suit, I think, as an industry, certainly not as programmatic. I think outcome is a really great construct and lens to think about this through, bringing everyone back to one shared goal of what actually needs to be achieved. And we can think about that from so many different layers. And actually, right now is a time for testing and experimentation and consolidating a lot of the information we believe we know about best practice, how to achieve results, and what those results may be. As we move forward, though, we're going to have less clarity of how all of those things come together. So the more we can understand them in the kind of constructs of today, the better able we will be to give them value and create a place for them in the future. And I think, one of the interesting places that we see this and prompts this is the difference between the walled gardens and the open internet. Because we're not going to be able to accurately, in the same way that we have been used to, measure clear purpose and outcome between the two. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative. Actually, we have a real opportunity to start rethinking and reframing our approach to how and what we are buying, what we should be buying. It's not just okay, well, these three things make up the main components of my media plan, and let's do a bit of this around the side of it. It's what can I see? What are my clients' business objectives? How can I take that through to media where I can create an outcome? Where can I see that specific outcome? And then what can I create to support that audience messaging and strength around it? I think there's an opportunity of kind of complementary foundational work with some really clear outcomes that we will still be able to see. As for one specific outcome that actually pertains to whether cookieless solutions are successful or not, again, it's that lack of kind of either both standardization, but also need. Every single client has a different business objective for each of their products and each of their kind of channels of communication. So we need to think of success for the purpose it has been designed for. And if that success is reaching huge numbers of people, then brilliant. We've ticked that box. We've been able to do that. If it is more of a kind of hard sales metric, then that's fine. But I think ultimately we see certainly more and more of our brands and clients are shifting their approach towards more personable metrics, engagement-led, access-led, creating a community-led, rather than those really, really hard KPIs at the end of the day. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
And touch on the point you're making about like community-led. Obviously, as a community, as an industry, it's clear there's still a lot of work in progress. And you know, Michelle just mentioned the word collaboration. So, you know, and that feels to me like collaboration is key. And testing and learning is key. So, you know, how are marketeers going to navigate, you know, the cookieless world based on the tools that we have access today? You know, how are we going to how are you going to collaborate? You know, how are you going to be able to navigate this? So it feels like your job's got more difficult, if I can say that.
I can go. I think from my perspective, yes, it's fragmented at best now, and we still have clients without clear rationales for why they're using the tools and tech that they're using. And that doesn't come down to kind of lack of decisioning. It comes down to the fact that there are so many out there, and we put ourselves and them all together as an industry under huge pressure to be experimenting and testing and making sure we have the kind of best in class for any single situation. So I think from my perspective, the collaboration needs to be about, per situation, investing in a core technology stack, which will ultimately support data clarity, audience creation, activation, analytics, so that we have a strong, in each instance, foundation to actually increase consumer engagement and grow first-party data. It's kind of CRM. I think we have far more tools than necessary. And actually, you know what, it's a blessing in most respects, as long as we can single out the right ones for the right use case, and make sure that we have deep partnerships with our publishers and our tech providers for the right use case, and drive those forward, because together, if we're pulling together in the same direction, we're going to move an awful lot faster than a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here.
Yeah, and I think from the publishing perspective, because, you know, we have a responsibility not just to our clients and our agency partners, but also to our users, you know, the visitors, the people who are consuming our content, which forces us to think really deeply and integrate conservatively with select partners. I mean, I think that to me is how the collaboration is going to work. You have to go deeper with fewer than spreading yourself too thin, and maybe that's unfair to, you know, that long tail. But I think I think we're starting to feel the pressure to be able to do that. I think I love the points that Claire's making about that tech stack, and I think again that trust applies across the board, but really a heightened focus on trust, a heightened focus on transparency and ethical use of data, which again, sometimes there's a little bit of tension there when you're trying to drive your own business results. But I think it's probably what we'll need to focus on in the next, regardless of what happens with Google or, you know, pauses and what they say they're going to do. Regardless of what happens, I think we need to start pushing it forward, because we're just in this weird limbo state, neither here nor there for the most part. So it's a little bit hard to plan.
So it's Tanya Raman. How did providers, you know, solution providers such as yourselves, how do you become part of the deeper few? What are you doing to kind of promote collaboration?
I'd say to start with, we need to be patient. in many ways, as our partners, the agencies, are doing great work on test and learn frameworks and building out the use cases which they can scale across a number of clients which fall into those similar use case buckets. But the reality is all of their clients are not ready yet to move along. So it's more around continuing to work and complete the solution, work towards the end-to-end capabilities, and continuing to build it out into something which is effectively more scalable once the masses do come in.
I guess we're not dissimilar, right? It is about patience, but it's about demonstrating. And I think for us, because we're an alternative type of ID, because we are not authenticated, we're able to identify users across the ghost web, which I think is a lot of the 85% that aren't identified otherwise. So for us, it's about test and learn in an environment. As I say, at the moment, we're using Japan and UAE to demonstrate end-to-end from agencies, through publishers and into the platforms. If we can demonstrate and prove how that works and the scale that can be delivered against, obviously underpinned, because this is really important, by the fact that it's a privacy-first approach, because the consumers are key in this, then I think that helps us underpin our argument to broaden that out across the rest of the arenas.
That's great. So it's I guess you're working to two KPIs. Obviously, it's the publisher. I don't want to put words into your mouth, Michelle, but I'm assuming that your consumer is front of mind, and so are your revenues. And Claire, not wanting to put words into your mouth, but it looks like I'm going to. You've got to deliver efficiently, and you've got to deliver that performance efficiently for advertisers. So there's always going to be, I think, a natural friction between the buy and the sell side. So how do the solution providers help kind of offer you a solution which is scalable, but scalable doesn't always necessarily translate well for the publisher? How do we navigate that? How do we navigate that world? Difficult question. Don't have to answer it.
I think it's a really valid question, though. It's not necessarily got an answer. I think we have a lot of good technology at our fingertips. And I think actually, if we go back to collaboration and fewer deeper, and really getting to grips with our audience, and therefore where they are engaging with content in different environments, there is a natural synergy to how we can all succeed and progress together, kind of with everyone's best interests at heart. And I think actually the areas, thinking about it, that I see we drive real success when we are talking about our supply relationships and really connecting those dots, are the ones where we take it back to the drawing board and we think about it, and we think about it from an audience first perspective, and where these people are, and then we go and create connections using partners, often, so using kind of SSP partners or whoever it may be, that can support our best practice and efficiencies that we need to be able to prove out as an agency on a day-to-day basis, but enable opening up to some really broad, diverse, interesting sections of the publisher landscape, and not just focusing on, and there is obviously a focus, but not just focusing on those really, really big named titles that you might expect to see as a kind of client-side planner, but making sure that there is true representation of where our audience come from and where they are engaging. So I think there isn't an answer, but I think somewhere within that Venn diagram of all those things, there is a sweet spot that if we get it right and we have the right conversations and we focus on it enough, we can really drive some positive change and success for everyone.
And that's a great point. And Michelle, do you want to kind of pick up on that? Is it from your perspective, is it not about driving scale, but it's about driving those deeper connections for the agency, and that's the role that you'll play moving forward within this kind of new epoch? Or
yeah, I mean, I think this whole, I think we were going in this direction anyway, but definitely, you know, what's happening in the industry now is forcing us to deepen our relationship with our users, and again, doubling down on the collection of first-party data assets is allowing us to really understand and create products and experiences for our audiences that in turn helps us partner better with the agencies. You know, deeper insights, deeper engagement, the context follows, you know, the content is there. You know, it's not, obviously everybody wants scale and efficiency, but it's also, you know, that deeper relationship and engagement that should drive better outcomes ultimately for our clients.
Absolutely. And I think we're almost at time. I could keep chatting with you guys, and I'm sure we're going to have more of these series come up, and more opportunities to kind of talk about the progress that we're making. But to end the discussion today, can I just hear from each of you what your predictions are for the next 12 months? I'm going to start with you first, Michelle.
I think even more transparency in our use of customer data. I think agencies and publishers, I think, will come together to agree. Maybe there's not just one solution, but agree on maybe a few paths to move forward.
Thanks, Michelle. And how about yourself, Claire?
I hope so. I hope we see more collaboration. I hope we all actually have these conversations and we're all in the room together. I think we'll see the shape of personal data change as understanding grows. I think the more consumers can view their own data as a commodity and sharing it as a decision transaction, I think the more will fuel zero-party data strategies and that kind of consent and trust-based relationship. And that then those brands who do know their audiences and can harness this kind of really accurate source will be in a great position to create more meaningful and relevant engagements with their consumers. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. So trust and transparency is the overriding theme that's coming from both the supply side and at the buy side. So Tanya, what insight is that something that you're aligned with? I mean, what are your predictions for the next 12 months?
I'm absolutely aligned with that. And I think there's going to be much more focus than there has already been. And there's been a lot of focus on it on first party data and how there can be scale created across disparate types of first party data. But actually, a bit more pragmatically, I think over the next 12 months, what we're going to see is a massive scramble if Google stick to their timetable of, what are we going to do to get a solution that enables us to carry on earning the revenues that we need to maintain delivery of the open web? So I'm a bit more pragmatic about, I think it's going to be a massive scramble.
Thank you, Tanya. So trust and transparency at the core, but it's going to be a scramble. Raman, what's your view?
I second the scramble. Reason being, the scramble already happened in Q4 of 2020 when we all thought the cookie would disappear and then we got an extension. So that's going to happen again, potentially at a bigger scale. On the trust and transparency front, I definitely agree with that. We've been working for a long time in providing analytics, building out analytics for cookieless. Doing so for both understanding changing consumer behavior and thereafterwards measurement and addressability. So it's definitely a hot topic for the year, and how can we continue to deliver addressability, and that forms part of trust and transparency just as well.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. I feel like we are making actually a lot of progress just through the conversations we've had today. A lot of progress is being made, but perhaps not at the pace we would like to be making the progress. And I think that's because it's a complex problem, right? but we all want the same thing, and that's a better internet for our consumers, and a more privacy by designed digital ecosystem. And I can see Lauren's back on screen, so I just want to thank the panelists for your time today. A fantastic discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Nick, for leading a great discussion. As you say, you probably could have carried on talking for much longer, but we are looking to do more in the series across the next 12 months as we head towards that proposed deadline to have these conversations. So do keep your eyes peeled for more coming soon. But yes, thank you, everyone. As I said at the beginning, we will share the recording with you all, and we'll also make sure we share the slides that Andrew presented at the beginning as well as a follow-up. But any questions or anything, do let us know. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.